Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior AP English, and now we will turn to Tennyson. Our objectives for the hour are really to pay close attention to what we will call Tennyson's Victorian critique. We will see this on two counts today, and then in a subsequent lecture, we will finish with the great British poet Tennyson. The first place we want to start is back at our shoe factory story, when we made the observation that all parties involved have to come to terms with the dynamic change of the Industrial Revolution. Now, we already saw gestures towards this Industrial Revolution and the change coming by 1800, when Wordsworth will say, "The world is too much with us late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours." That idea is that the industry and the rise of technology is somehow distancing us from the nature that makes us increasingly more human, not less human. Tennyson is living now roughly 80 years later, and already England is drastically changing, as we pointed out with our little story about the shoe factory. And one of the things that we didn't really talk about was the challenge in regards to the relationship of gender, and so now we want to do that. Tennyson and poets that will follow him and writers that will follow him are aware of a fundamental shift that is starting to occur between males and females. So let's talk a little bit about the Victorian view of women. When we use this term, Victorian, we are talking roughly about a time period from about 1850 to 1910, roughly. Okay, that's roughly kind of the timeline we're talking about. There is a real strong effort during this time to try to curb or to hold back what is inevitably coming and the movement that is inevitably coming. Again, this change in the relationship between men and women, what we sometimes will call the gender wars, has at its root our shoe factory story. I'll go back to it one more time. Sherman loses his job because Schreiber has to decide to take the machine that Batson from Boston is selling. Because of Schreiber's decision, Sherman losing his job will force him into a different relationship with his wife, Anderson. That's just the way that it is. Now, we already pointed out that one of the first things that Sherman is going to say to his 8 children as they age is the future is now intricately linked in ways never before considered or imagined with your education. Your education becomes your calling card. What you will become will be directly related to the education that you possess. Now, of course, today, we kind of know that intuitively, which is the reason why we take upper-level classes in our senior year of high school with the expectation that when we arrive at the university, we are well prepared for the rigor that will ultimately set us apart so that financially we can feed ourselves 50 years from now. We're aware of that at an intuitive level now. Not so when you're Sherman. Sherman didn't have to worry about his future or his children's future because the assumption was everybody's going to be working at Schreiber's shoe factory. When Schreiber's shoe factory, notice it doesn't close down, it just loses Sherman. So there's other people who stay on the factory floor. We could talk about the survivor's guilt associated with that project. Of course, the fear as well. Well, if he laid us off, some of us off today, but I didn't get laid off, I might get laid off tomorrow. All of a sudden, all those guys who still continue to show up at Schreiber's shoe factory, they show up with a little bit of concern. As we've already pointed out, Schreiber, every day for the rest of his life, will wake up with a different kind of anxiety because Batson came into his office. But I want to stick with Sherman for a second. He's got to go home. He's got to look Anderson in the eye and say, all my life I've worked at a shoe factory and now I can't work at a shoe factory. Let's point out right away, Anderson can, I guess you could say to him, well, go get another job. But the only problem is, the only skill set that Sherman has is making shoes. He never went to university and got a degree in business, and he decided that shoe factory work was the way to make his living. That's not how Sherman came to his job. Got me? It's possible, in fact, he barely can read. He doesn't need to read to work on shoes in a shoe factory. Anderson, his wife, has had virtually no education because she's a woman. Her job is to be domesticated and to take care of her children. And large families are the order of the day, right? So when he comes home and tells Anderson, I've got no job, there is a powerful ripple effect. Think about it in your notes. What are the ripple effects? First of all, think about it from the perspective of Sherman. Sherman gets to go home and tell his girl he doesn't have a job. What does that do to Sherman? Just start thinking about this out loud. Is he going to do it this way? Yay, I got no job, which means now we can travel to the Bahamas and lay on a beach the way we always dream. No. Right? A man's employment defines who and what he is. If you've ever been in a situation where you watched someone you loved, especially a male, go through the process of losing his job, not having work, it is a fundamental challenge to, for lack of a better phrase, his manhood. Who is he? What is he? Schreiber has laid off Sherman, and Sherman now can't work. Sherman's got to come home and tell his wife, I got no job. I'm going to go and try and find employment, but it's not going to be the kind of money that I used to make on the shoe factory floor. And the reality is, I probably will never make that kind of living again, ever. Now let's go to Anderson, because this is where it gets really interesting. What's the effect on Anderson when Sherman loses his job? Think about it for a moment with me. What does she do? Well, bummer luck for us, I guess. I guess that means all 8 of our children, just don't get fed. We're going to watch them slowly starve to death. Right? What's going to be Anderson's response to Sherman losing his job? See, this is interesting, because Schreiber, in laying off Sherman, he realizes there's going to be effect economically on Sherman's wife. What Schreiber cannot understand at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is what he's helping to unleash. What do you mean unleash? I don't understand. What do you mean unleash? What is it that Anderson's going to have to do?
Get a job.
Sooner or later, she's going to leave the house and go get employment. So what? Big deal. I don't get it. So what? Why is that a big dog deal? McGee just said Schreiber's unleashing forces he has no idea is coming. Well, let's just imagine that Sherman and Anderson have a daughter. All right? Obviously, I said the conversation with his son is, you better get an education. Guess what the conversation with his daughter is? What is it? Right. You better get an education. Why? Why? Because there is a potentiality, economically speaking. Mama's about to go get work. And for the first time, those kids are going to watch her work. Now, that is not to say that a woman who is, quote unquote, domesticated is not a worker, right? Working in the home is working, but there's no salary or paycheck that attends it. Let's point out something fundamentally important here. Anderson is not saying to Sherman, her guy, I think we need more money so we can do holiday in the Bahamas. I'm going to go get a job. Do you understand? Schreiber's releasing Sherman from employment has a natural progressive kind of evolutionary economic reality. Anderson will go get a job, not because she wants to get a job, but because she has to get a job. But in the process of getting a job, Anderson is going to begin to discover new things about Anderson. She's going to step out into, for example, a part of the city maybe she's never been in her life. She's going to begin to befriend other women who also have employment. What happens when she comes home in the evening? The question will remain, who does the cooking? Who does the cleaning? Who takes care of the children? Well, Anderson now has an interesting argument. Why do I got to be the one that makes the meal? Dude, I've been working just as long as you've been working today. You make the meal. There will become a natural shift so that by the time the 20th century arrives, the First and the Second World War will exacerbate or spin this movement at light speed. Why? Because in the First World War, the men go off to fight, leaving the women at home to take care of the children. But as the war progresses, increasingly you have to have more men fighting in the fields. That means they can't be working in the factories. To drop a bomb, you have to make a bomb. To sail a ship, you have to build a ship. And that takes a tremendous labor force. Almost all of it at the beginning of the war is male. Almost all of the labor force at the beginning of the war is male. But by the end of the war, it's already starting to shift. And females are required to go into the labor force and begin to work. By the Second World War, this kind of thing has already started to become normality. So that by the end of the Second World War, large numbers of women are working full-time in the factories and elsewhere. Then the war ends. This is a really interesting moment in world history. Then the war ends, especially in America and in Europe. The war ends, and all the men come back home, the ones who survived the war. And they immediately are ready to go back to their factory jobs. The only problem is their factory jobs are being worked by many women. There is this interesting shift that takes place in the 50s, where women are told, you got to go back in the home and just be a mom and take care of blah, blah, blah. They do it, but gradually they begin to say out loud what they've been thinking for some time. You know, working is kind of a pain, but there's some advantages to it as well. I feel like I'm contributing in some way. I feel like I am defining myself and my identity through my work. And to that degree, by the 50s and 60s and on into the 70s, and of course by 70s, think about it, do the quick math. How far are we away from your birth? Right? The majority of you will be born into a home where both your mother and your father worked. If that was not the case, it probably was because of choice. In other words, the woman in the family said, I don't want to work. Most of us were raised in families where both a mother and a father had to work, which creates a really interesting movement by the 50s in regards to how women see themselves and how men see women. Go back real quickly to Aristotle's little pyramid. You'll remember Aristotle saw this pyramid as being functionally absolute. He said it was just like Ruthie's tree out there, not being a Christmas tree, but looking like that. And he said, first you've obviously got the gods, then you've got men, then you've got women, and that's the way it is. Anyone screwing with this project for Aristotle is going against the laws of God and nature. That is dangerous. I don't know how many of you were able to see Steve Spielberg's classic film Lincoln. But in the middle of the debate about whether they're going to give some sense of identity to black slaves, there is a suggestion made in the middle of one of the speeches on the floor that if this process goes forward, there might be a moment where women are given the right to vote. And in a powerful moment, all of those men stand up and start screaming in complete disapproval. It is the worst imaginable idea that women would be given the right to vote. Of course, we're debating this at exactly the same time Tennyson's writing The Lady of Shalott. Let's go to it. Tennyson is genius because what he wants to do is he wants to resurrect this question of the relationship of the sexes or the gender. But the way he's going to do it is by going back in time to the time of Camelot. And more particularly, he's going to pick up on the notion of the motif of Lancelot. Now let's talk about Lancelot for just a moment. Lancelot is what kind of man? See, write it down in your notes real quickly. Lancelot is what kind of man? There are some things that define Lancelot by definition. He is a character type in poetry. What kind of man is he? What do we want to say about him?
Isn't he like the good-looking?
He is stunningly handsome. Stunningly handsome. I mean, everyone that sees this guy when he walks in a room goes, whoa, 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 who is that? He is the Brad Pitt of his day. He is the guy that will always get the part simply by virtue of his looks. Keep going. What else do we know about him? What kind of fighter is he? What kind of warrior is he? Is he lame? Not quite. He is both Achilles and Aeneas, isn't he? He is a fierce warrior, but he's also really smart. He's brilliant. What else do we know about him? I mean, he's already got 2 nice marks in his favor, we might say. Right? What's the third thing?
Rich.
Yeah, he's got wealth. Yeah, he comes from family, but he will renounce all of it to serve his king. That is to say, he's a warrior, he's a fighter, he's a soldier.
Isn't he honest?
Known to be honest? Well, let's say it this way. Yeah, he is unbelievably honest until he's not. What is the one thing that he's dishonest about? Oh yeah, that little thing with Guinevere. Now here's the thing, and it's important in the motif of Lancelot. Lancelot has no girl. He's got no wife. Lancelot is single, but he likes women. He is the quintessential player. He can get any woman he wants, and sometimes he does. We should point out that in the Lancelot motif, he of course will go for the one woman who is the impossible get. The most beautiful woman in the kingdom is of course Guinevere, and she's already married to his best friend, right? So in other words, his best friend, who just happens to be the king, which is a nice thing to be the king, right? The king already has the best looking girl. Lancelot can get any other girl, not good enough. He wants the one girl he can't get until he can get her. And he does get her. Let's keep going. What is it that Lancelot is also known for? Getting the girl means what? In the Arthurian motif, he does get her. But in the process, what happens? Kind of destroys Camelot, huh? He is the destroyer. Now let's point out, it's not like Lancelot wakes up some morning and says, you know, it'd be really nice to hook up with Guinevere, have a nice time, and then completely destroy the very kingdom I'm working to try to save under King Arthur. No. No. In other words, let's point out, Lancelot, he will help to destroy or bring down Camelot, but he doesn't do it knowledgeably or willingly. Okay? Although Freud will have much debate about this in his writings, about how much Lancelot really already understands. Of course, now we come to Lady of Shalott, and we'll ask the question. Lancelot comes along on his pretty horse with his stunning looks and his beautiful singing voice, and there he is riding his little pony along past the castle. The Lady of Shalott is stuck up in the castle. She is not supposed to look out. She cannot keep herself from looking at Lancelot. And in the moment of seeing him, everything goes south. Question: do you blame Lancelot for the fall of the Lady of Shalott? Is it his fault? Is there any responsibility Lancelot has for this? Does he even know she exists up in the castle? Not a clue. Like most Lancelots who have all those things you just listed, they don't have to spend time wondering where the next girl's going to come from. They know it's going to turn up pretty quickly by virtue of who they are. That is to say, Lancelot has all the power. Of course, he looks at women how? What is it that he says about the Lady of Shalott? The only time he ever sees her is when she's dead. And what is it that he says about her?
She's hot.
She could be a Victoria's Secret model. Wow, she's hot. Which tells you what about the way he sees women? What does it tell you about the... Notice the first thing he says is, geez, some mother lost her daughter. Or some father lost his daughter. I wonder what her family life was like. I wonder what she could have been if she could have lived. That is not his view at all. The only thing that he can see in this dead girl is her physical appearance interests him. Only now she's dead, and so he's not going to have her as a conquest. What does it tell you about Lancelot's view of women and how he views all women, not just the Lady of Shalott? Anybody want to say? What do you think, Miss Ramos? How does he view women, do you think?
Not very well.
In what way not well?
Like, he only looks at their physical beauty.
Because
He can.
women are for him
A trophy.
a trophy. And that's interesting she would use that language because we're familiar with the notion of trophies, aren't we? That's why we go all the way back to last September where we started our conversations. Remember? The greatest warrior, Achilles, is going to pull out of the fight. Why? He doesn't get his trophy. Guys, Achilles can go get any girl he wants. But the one girl that he wants he can't get, now he's mad he's going to pull out of the war. Lancelot sees women as potential trophies. Question, can any guy see it otherwise? Is that the way guys are hardwired? Or, as Andy just said, no. This is an issue of age. Once guys get older, they mature. And then they don't have this adolescent notion that women are trophies to be conquered. They have a different ability. They become much wiser and far more... Wait a minute, Lancelot's not a young adolescent. Ouch. That was nasty, Tennyson. Nasty. Yeah, no. We're not talking about some kid who works at the mall. We're talking about the greatest man, Lancelot, who is predicated on the greatest man, Aeneas, who jacks Dido up, who's predicated on the greatest man, Odysseus, who spends a number of years with Calypso in that cave, remember? Who's predicated on the greatest man, Achilles, who drops out of the war because he can't get his trophy. Some of you are putting the mathematics together and saying, in Western thought, there seems to be a continuity of theme in regards to men and the way they think about women, which might not only explain high school, might explain Western culture. Do you honestly think it's going to change as you step onto university campuses? I remember giving this lecture a few years ago, and a student said, well, yeah, it's like that cat down at the University of Wyoming they threw a party for the other night. We heard about it. I said, party about what? Oh, he's the ball player on the campus. And when he finally slept with his 100th girl documented on that campus, they threw him a huge party, and over 300 people showed up, including many of the girls that he slept with who carried it as a badge of honor. That yes, he was the guy that they slept with as part of his conquest of 100 in one semester.
Oh, I just see a lot of STDs there.
Well, now wait a minute. That's fascinating. What was even more interesting was that in our classroom there was an interesting debate right away about whether this guy was a loser or he was a winner. Let's go ahead and just say it out loud. On the campus at Laramie, this guy was known to be a winner for this activity, not a loser. Among his peers, who were guys. Now, wait a minute. Is it fair to say that's all guys? Or can we say, well, look, there's Lancelot, and then there's Percival, who would never consider this kind of activity, because Percival is chaste. He would never consider sleeping with Guinevere because he knows it's the wrong thing to do. He would look at the Lady of Shalott and he would say, wow, it's sad, Mama lost her daughter. I wonder what her life could have been. He sees her differently. But wait a minute, in the Arthurian motif, Lancelot is the hero. Percival is the second grade hero, second tier hero. We could do that game, by the way, in every one of our stories. We could find a second-tier hero that's kind of like the buddy of the Achillean hero. And he's usually the more chaste, the more disciplined, the more guy keeps it together, especially in regards to women. But that's not who's celebrated in the texts as being the hero of all heroes. What is Tennyson trying to say about men and women? Well, we've picked on guys long enough. Let's go to the girls, shall we? Let's be fair. The girl knows, Lady of Shalott, knows that if she looks out the window at Lancelot, she will get jacked. She knows that. And she does it anyway. Now, is this female psyche? Women choose their own destruction, and it's called men. They choose it. And after the fact, they'll always be able to agree with their friends who say, man, he was a real jerk. I know. Why couldn't I see that? Is it true women are blind in their choosing of companionship with men? And if that's the case, is it totally natural? It's just the way women are hardwired. Question, back to my whiteboard. Does this explain anything about the Lady of Shalott? Does this explain anything about her decision? She's been raised all her life and told, men above you, you need a man to define who you are. She's been told that all her life. When she finally has her shot, she takes it, even though it leads to her own death. Has the culture shifted, or is it still the case that women define themselves by the guy they're attracted to? Is this symbiotic? Are guys defined by the girl they're attracted to? And how healthy is this? And watch my whiteboard. What would ever happen in the history of the world? I'm obviously speaking somewhat idiomatically. What would ever happen in the history of the world if this were to happen? I'm asking you a two-part question. If this were to happen. But wait a minute, Miss Katie, I'm not quite done. Now I'll really speak idiomatically. What would happen in the history of the world? Sorry, Shride. If this were to happen.
Utter chaos.
What would ever happen in the history of the world if either of those two things happened? The Victorian era is an attempt to try to keep both of those things from happening. Are you ready for this? You see it in that Lincoln film in that one moment when the mere suggestion that women would be given the right to vote would lead to, as Mr. Schreiber just said it, complete chaos. Because in the Victorian era, men are convinced that if, watch my whiteboard, if this ever happens, this by definition must happen. In other words, the genders will never be equal. They cannot be co-equal. They can't. Somebody's got to run the show. That's Aristotelian ideology. Somebody's got to run the show. There's got to be a leader. There's got to be somebody that tells everybody else what to do. Plato, remember, made this same argument. It's either going to be men or it's going to be women. In the Victorian era, then, there is an attempt to try to control women by men. Are you ready for this? The number one way to do it is, of course, sexually. There is an entire mythology that is created that women have uncontrollable sexual lust. And they rewrite the idea of the fall of Camelot by saying, Lancelot chose Guinevere because of Guinevere. It was her fault. It was her fault. And that is to say, Lancelot can't be blamed. It was Guinevere. This will, of course, become most clearly present in, for example, the debate that will ensue in the 20th century. When, for example, young women will begin to be poorly treated by men, and their responses often will be, well, look at what she was doing, or look at what she was wearing, or look at how she was acting. She clearly was asking for this. It was her fault, not my fault. I was simply doing what guys do. She should have been able to control herself. That dynamic begins to be spoken of out loud in the Victorian era. And therefore, it's a simple answer. Men must control their women. The way they do that is, of course, by making sure that they get married. It's simple. You domesticate them. You do not allow them to have the experiences that men have. In other words, watch my whiteboard. If you want to keep this dynamic easily in place, it's very simple, because obviously biologically there's a difference between males and females. So if you want to keep this from changing, it's very simple. Whatever these guys do, you don't let these guys do. Simple. Whatever men are allowed to do, don't let women do it. Therefore, education, women do not have the same education as men. It's a different kind of education. Understandings of economics. See, in the story that I told, for example, when Sherman comes to Anderson and says, "I've lost my job," she really doesn't know what that means, because it's altogether possible she does not even know how much money he has paid. He will have never spoken with her about that. Why not? Because she's a woman. And clearly women can't do things like mathematics anyway. See, this whole mythology is created there. Women are incapable, psychologically, mentally, of doing this kind of work. This mythology, of course, is staring in the face of Sherman coming home and telling Anderson, "I've lost my job, you're going to have to go get a job." It doesn't take her long. Think of it this way. Anderson's daughter will grow up in a different world than she grew up in as a woman. But her granddaughter will really grow up in a different world. Right? And some of you are aware of this if you have conversations with your great-grandmas, if they're still around, or your grandmas if they're around. And you're aware the shift in regards to this whole dynamic. But you are the recipients at the end of the 20th century. But the debate still rages on. Whose fault is it that the Lady of Shalott makes her choice? Do you blame it on Lancelot for being who and what Lancelot is? Do you blame it on the Lady of Shalott for being unable to control her desires or her passions? And does Tennyson seem to suggest a way out, or is he just simply showing us the future? This is inevitably where it goes. Tennyson himself is clearly confused about this whole dynamic between Sherman and Anderson. What is it? What will be the new relationship? By the time you are born, of course, it will already be in full swing. This discussion, watch my whiteboard, this discussion about whether women should be below men, equal with men, above men, is what we mean by feminism. That's the discussion. That is the debate. Within that camp, there are three answers. One, a group of men and women that say this is natural and necessary. Men must run women. A second argument is that they must be co-equals. They're equals in every way. Other than biologically, they're equals in every way. Now, opportunities, etc. The third is the most intriguing. And it says, in the end, it's time for women to run the show. We've had enough of Achilles and Lancelot. As Queen Elizabeth said it, little men running around, sticking their little body parts where they don't belong, and starting great big wars. She said, "I'll have none of it," which is why she never married. She didn't have any interest in it. She says something like that at 1600. We're 200 years before Tennyson's Lady of Shalott. Thank you. Come back tomorrow. We'll